Tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union built throughout World War II, and following the defeat of the Axis, the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union began the Cold War. This talks about how the Soviet Union tried to take away or claim land from Europe. Following World War II, the Soviets wanted the land to create communist buffer zones between them and their enemies in the West.
During the Cold War, capitalism represented by the United States and communism represented by the Soviet Union were opposite in nature. While capitalism placed a strong emphasis on private property ownership and market forces, communists promoted state control over the economy and a society without class. As a result, there was a significant ideological gap between the two blocs regarding political freedoms and economic system.
The Yalta Conference took place in a Russian resort town in Crimea from February 4 to 11, 1945, when they were less certain that the Pacific War was coming to a conclusion. The Allied commanders arrived at Yalta believing that an Allied victory in Europe was all but certain. The United States and Great Britain perceived a significant strategic advantage the Soviet involvement in the Pacific theater. Realizing that defeating Japan could mean a longer war, the future of the United Nations, Germany and Eastern Europe were all topics of discussion among the Allied leaders.
Cost of post-war reparations. The Yalta agreements were met with a jubilant reception at first. Many Americans, including Roosevelt, saw it as evidence that the spirit of U.S.-Soviet.
In May 1945, victory in Europe and Germany surrendered to the Red Army in Berlin. When German Federal signed Germany's surrender on all fronts in Rome, France, two people signed surrenders. First, German signed Germany's surrender on all at Reims, France on May 7, 1945. Following the day in Berlin, German Field Marshal Wilhelm Tell made the second signing, which Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin had insisted. Both Joel and Kirill were later hanged after the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg. Germany declared them guilty of the war crimes. Tens of millions of soldiers and civilians have been murdered since hostilities began, and the majority of the fighting in Europe came to a conclusion on Victory in Europe Day. Victory in Europe Day was celebrated globally after numerous deaths that occurred during the war in Europe. In August 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. During World War II, an American B-29 bomber exploded, the first atomic bomb ever dropped over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. On August 6, 1945, an estimated 80,000 people were killed quickly by the explosion, and tens of thousands more would later die from toxic exposure. An estimated 4,000 people were killed when a second bomb B-90 blew up another A-bomb on Nagasaki. 3 days later, in a radio broadcast on August 15, Emperor Hirohito of Japan declared his nation unconditional surrender in World War II, pointing to serious potential of a new and most crucial bomb.
Soviet aggression drove the Cold War. The first front of the Cold War was located in Germany. The zones were controlled by France, Britain, and the United States, combined from West Germany. Allies also controlled the western part of
In July 1945, Potsdam Conference happened and Germany was officially partitioned into 4 zones of occupation. Germany was split into 4 occupied zones following the Potsdam Conference: the Soviet Union in the east, the United States in the south, France in the southwest, and Great Britain in the northwest. The capital city of the Soviet, Berlin, likewise split up into 4 occupied zones. Additionally, Poland grabbed land east of the Oder and Neisse rivers from Germany. Approximately 15 million ethnic Germans who had lived in this region were evicted, and they suffered terrible conditions while doing so. Others were subjected to forced labor camps run by the government of Poland and Czechoslovakia, while many perished from starvation or freezing on overcrowded trains.
From the end of the World War II in 1945 until the end of the Cold War in 1991, the Iron Curtain served as the fake border that divided Europe into 2 distant regions. The phrase represented that the Soviet Union's attempts to keep itself and its satellite governments isolated from the West in regions not under its control. The nations allied with or impacted by the Soviet Union were located on the east side of the Iron Curtain. The Truman Doctrine obsessed Soviet aggressions in March 1947. President Truman, both of the houses of the Congress, to support the free people who are resisting attempted subjugation, conquest by armed minorities, or by outside pressures. Also, President Truman promised to aid nations struggling against the communist movements, became known as the Truman Doctrine. They set new courses for the American foreign policies in the United States responds with Marshall Plan. The containment policies first was the greatest successful containment policy in the Western Europe.
In February 1946, Stalin's hostile speech, communism and capitalism were incapable. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin gave a highly known election speech in Moscow's Bolshoi Theatre on February 9, 1946. An electoral speech to the Supreme Soviet was elected every 4 years in the Soviet Union. Stalin was a rival, but he had no rivals. The speech's strongest aspect is how different the tone is from Stalin's speeches during the time of war. The Soviet leader boldly reasserts a Marxist Leninist perspective. For the first time in nearly 5 years, Stalin used patriotic rhetoric about Mother Russia to his communist beliefs throughout World War II. The ensure his American and British allies that he was a loyal ally in their fight against Hitler. He had downplayed his communists, but with the war won, he turned against them and sought to expand communism. After winning the war in Europe but losing the British general election in July 1945, Churchill gladly accepted the invitation to share the same platform as the US president. Churchill was aware that though the world was ready to it past the terrible acts of war, the events of early 1946 hinted at a more bleak future. The Soviet Union had started rebuilding Eastern Europe in their image following the Allied achievement, merging the governments of lots of nations with Moscow. Churchill said an iron curtain has descended in Europe between East and West.
Between capitalism and communism during the early Cold War, they were influenced the actions of the United States and the Soviet Union, driving policies like containment, leading the formation of NATO as a Western military alliance, and directly contributing the events like the Berlin blockade, where the Soviets attempted to prevent West Berlin develop a capitalist system, as both sides fought to prevent the spread of their opposing ideology across the globe. In order to stop the spread of the Soviet-backed communists, the United States, which was committed to capitalism and democracy, developed a policy of containment, in which it offered financial and military assistance to nations opposing communist control. As part of the containment, the U.S. launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild war-torn Western Europe infrastructure, aiming to prevent communist takeover by carrying capitalist systems. The Soviet Union, under communist ideology, searched to expand its circle of influence in Eastern Europe, establishing communist governments in Eastern Europe, which the U.S. viewed as a threat.
The diversion of Berlin into Western and Soviet sectors after World War II led to the Berlin blockade, where the Soviets attempted to starve West Berlin into submission by cutting off land access, so they could not prevent the spread of communism in the city. The blockade was an attempt of keeping out the Western powers, because the Soviets saw the formation of a dramatic West Berlin as a challenge to their communist ideology in Eastern Europe. The United States and its Western allies created an alliance to counter the Soviet Union and communism. The U.S. fear of Soviet expansion across Europe, fueled by their ideological differences, drove the creation of NATO as a defensive alliance to further communists. The major issue at Potsdam was the question of how to handle Germany.
One side wants Germany to pay a lot for the war. The other wants to let Germany rebuild, because one side wants to be punished and one side wants to prevent it from happening. The Allied leaders were able to come to some agreements in Potsdam, with many disagreements. Any military equipment that was made in Germany were banned, and all German military and organizational units were to be gone. They were redrawing Polish borders with Germany and the Soviet Union. It is important to them because they had to move several million people.
Destabilizing. So, to recap, the Cold War was a turning point because the open yet restricted rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies that developed after World War II. With limited use of weapons, and Cold War was fought on the fronts of the political process, economics, and propaganda. What do you think would have happened if the Cold War never taken place? Society today would probably be different than today. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to Bad Ideas on Jack Patke. For more deep dives into history, feel free to share your thoughts with us on YouTube. Thank you.
We love you.